This presentation is about how you might use conversation analysis to evaluate aesthetic experiences. Now, the reason to do something like that is that there are long-standing philosophical problems in arts evaluation that stem essentially from the fact that we tend to think of aesthetic experience as an internal psychological phenomenon, something that can't be measured directly. So we have to theorize about what might be happening and then measure what we've theorized. The problem there is that especially in art forms that don't have established methods of display and evaluation, it creates all kinds of problems. We don't necessarily know what people might be experiencing or what the relevant forms of evaluation are. So our theoretical models and our evaluations or experiments might target completely the wrong kinds of phenomena. So we need to have an evaluative framework that takes into account what emerges through people's interactions with one another around art, because it's through interaction that they expose their subjective experiences to others intersubjectively. This problem is really exemplified in a report by Krosicka-Kaczynska called Understanding the Value of Arts and Culture, where they report on the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council's Cultural Value Project and all the different things that cultural organisations tend to measure: social engagement, reflective individuals, well-being, educational and health outcomes. And some of these are more intuitively measurable than others, but they tend to fall between this subjective and objective orientation in measurement. But of course, each of these forms of value require their own evaluation strategy, as the report mentions. What varies there is standards of evidence, methodologies, modes of engagement. So it really reiterates this age-old problem. But the report does make two key recommendations. One is that we should do evaluation not just to give a report to our funders as part of some kind of accountability exercise. We should do it as a part of the cultural production itself, and I agree with that. And secondly, they say that what we need is an observatory for cultural value. And they don't say what that is, but I find it a tremendously intriguing idea. So I'm thinking of this observatory as a kind of space telescope, because we do need new scientific instruments, new questions, new research methods that can give us an insight into the relationship between aesthetic experience and the kinds of things that we can evaluate in the arts. So let's think of this observatory as a thing that can help us to observe art as an occasion that happens with people in time. And it's in those occasions that forms of cultural value are produced, manifested by people's interactions with one another, and we can get a clue from looking at those interactions what are the relevant things to evaluate and measure. I'm going to use this Space Telescope Observatory of Cultural Value to transport us back to the 1990s. It's not actually a space telescope, it is the British National Corpus of Spoken English that I'm using. But this amazing resource was recorded by people carrying around tape recorders in their daily lives, at work, at home, when they were doing all kinds of things. And we can see by listening to it and looking at the transcripts all the ways in which aesthetic experiences become relevant in their daily lives. Now, I'm going to show you these audio excerpts, and you're going to see transcripts that I've made using Gail Jefferson's transcription format that she designed to show the interactional facility of conversation, all of the details, the pauses, the overlaps. And I'm not going to talk about her methodology, conversation analysis. I'm going to show you how I'm using it to see how people make different kinds of value and different forms of evaluation relevant through their interactions. I'm also going to show you some visualizations made by an artist who I just gave these recordings to. The drawings that you see were dreamt up by somebody listening to the excerpts you're about to listen to. So the first evaluative project that we can look at here is between Stefan and Catherine. Stefan's a gallerist, Catherine's his friend, and I want you to pay attention to the sorts of criteria that emerge as relevant to their evaluation through this interaction. So we're going to start by looking at how Catherine first makes some form of evaluation relevant.
That is beautiful.
I just want to point out here that Stefan's opportunity to participate in this evaluation doesn't come from some spontaneous psychological experience of his. It comes from Catherine evaluating it first, saying, oh, that is beautiful. Anita Pomerantz, a famous conversation analyst, in a 1984 paper on agreement and disagreement with assessments, points out that what becomes relevant after a first assessment is a second assessment that upgrades the first. if I say to you, that is beautiful, the normative response from you would be, oh, isn't it wonderful, an upgrade? Or if I say that's terrible, you'll say, yes, it's really despicable, a downgrade. So let's see what Stefan actually does next, given that an upgraded second assessment is due from him. What Stefan does is a bit too little, a bit too late. There's 0.5 of a second of silence and then yes. If you think about it, say you give somebody a plate of food, you sit down to eat, you taste it and you say, delicious. And they say, yes. It's less than praise for the food that you've just given them, isn't it? I want to point out this moment because it's where their conversation begins to go off the rails a bit. And it goes off the rails in several ways. On the one hand, we see not disagreement, but less than agreement. And on the other hand, we start to see what Tanya Stivers in a 2008 paper calls disalignment, which is where we don't necessarily disagree, we just start doing slightly different things. What begins with Catherine's evaluation of something that they're looking at together turns into something slightly different. And I'll just play you that excerpt so you can see how it in fact unfolds.
What is that?
It's contemporary
What's this colour?
Knieder.
Stefan's yes puts the ball back in Catherine's court, and when she asks him what is that, he responds by naming it as a contemporary Knieder. His art historical knowledge of the name, the time period, these are the things that he responds with as relevant to her question. And it's at this point that there begins to be some observable disalignment in what they're doing, because Catherine mishears Knieder as Klee, a different artist from a completely different era. And it's at this point that their conversation turns to questions of value that don't correspond to her initial assessment of beautiful. And I'll show you what I mean. I've fast forwarded through a bit of this conversation, but we're still in the sequence that was initiated by Catherine assessing this painting as beautiful. But we've moved on to what now looks like an interrogation where Catherine is questioning Stefan as to how decisions are made about what to sell in his gallery, and in the process naming various criteria that you might use to judge whether an appropriate assessment of whether it's valuable enough to be sold has been made.
Who decides, who accepts things?
Experts.
How many? All from Zurich?
No, London.
What?
London and Zurich. Contemporary Zurich. Everything which is contemporary.
Is one
is
man?
decided. No, it's a woman.
A
Our
woman?
director who decides.
She's good?
Very good.
She decides
She decides.
whether she accepts them or not to sell. And she...
Her initial question is about who makes the decision, and Stefan simply replies experts rather curtly. Where are they from? Which city? Which time period do they deal with? Is it a man? Is it a woman? Are they a good judge of whether or not something is valuable? All of these appear as relevant to their evaluation, and in a sense what we see is the hierarchy of decision making in the art world reflected through the evaluation criteria that they're using in this context. I want to play what happens next after Catherine's interrogation grinds to a halt, because it shows that this isn't an isolated or arbitrary incident. This is an aesthetic experience which is repeated in a series of similarly structured sessions where they evaluate something as beautiful and then begin to look at all the parameters that are relevant to its evaluation in the context of a commercial art gallery. Here's the next one.
Oh, that's quite nice.
Catherine assesses as something as quite nice. Stefan responds with the artist's name, and another sequence begins. Another thing that we can observe by looking at art as an occasion is how people design their evaluations for particular others in particular circumstances. So we're going to tune into a conversation between Mark and Stuart, two builders working on a building site, and you'll hear that Mark begins to ask Stuart whether he's ever seen a real Jackson Pollock.
You ever seen a real Jackson Pollock? Only on the TV, innit? Up at Royal Academy. Places like that. A lot of art lover.
Then there's this long pause where it's all got a bit awkward.
Last time I went to an art museum was at school.
Well, it may not be awkward, they may just be working, but I think what happens here is that Mark asks if Stuart has ever seen a real Jackson Pollock. Real making a distinction immediately between whether you've seen one or you've seen it in a postcard or a reproduction, or here Stuart actually says, well, only on TV. And Mark then begins to talk about going to the Royal Academy, and Stuart cuts him off and says, I don't go to places like that, I'm not an art lover. And this leads to this 7.1 seconds of silence. And that is a strong claim by Stuart that more or less creates a problem for Mark. Well, what's he going to do with I'm not an art lover? And in fact, it's only after that 7.1 seconds silence, Stuart rose back a little bit and says, well, last time I went to an art museum was on a school trip, so he was coerced into it. Now, the thing I want you to pay attention to is what Mark then says when he restarts telling his story about seeing a Jackson Pollock. Let's see how he actually gets that done.
Went to the Royal Academy when I was doing my O-level. It was a Jackson Pollock up there. The canvas was about 12 foot by 12 foot.
So Mark restarts his story, but this time he says that it was his school trip. So he moves towards what Stuart has just explained as his last experience in an art gallery where he was coerced in going to it. The other thing that Mark does is he waits a really long time, 7.7 seconds, kind of waiting to see what happens next. Nothing happens. And then he brings the artwork into the conversation. It's worth mentioning that whereas Catherine and Stefan are sitting in front of the artwork, Mark and Stuart are doing some painting. They're at work. So Mark has to bring the Jackson Pollock's canvas and its size into the frame that is then available for them to do an assessment together. Now let's just see what he does with it once he's described it into the situation.
It was literally splodges of paint all over the fucking place and horrible. It was that you can actually buy them at the Royal Academy, you can't buy them from the takeout. But he was asking £100,000 for it. Couldn't fucking believe it. Trained monkey could have fucking paid it better.
So the payoff of Mark's story is this strong negative evaluation, which he can only do once he's brought it into the situation by describing it. And the last thing I want to point out about this is that the kinds of things that Mark and Stuart name as relevant to the Jackson Pollock are the same sorts of things that Stefan and Catherine thought of as relevant. Where can you buy it? How much does it cost? Which gallery does and doesn't sell it? But the way that they bring these up are quite different from the way that Catherine and Stefan bring them up. So even though you might think of them sharing a sort of ontology of what is the relevant aspects of an artwork for evaluating it, actually the ways that they're using those same sorts of qualities are quite different. And it's worth paying attention to their interaction to track how are they using those kinds of criteria. So finally, we're going to look at how people use aesthetics and their ability to understand art and talk about it and respond to it and draw out their subjective experiences of it to one another in talk. So essentially their aesthetic sensibilities, how do they use them? And I'm talking about use of it in the same way that Richard Hoggart talks about uses of literacy early in the founding of cultural studies. That was one of the big questions was, well, people can read now. What are they using their ability to read for in social context? And this is what I'm interested in, using conversation as a way of seeing, well, how do people use their cultural experiences? What are the cultural lives of artworks? So we're going to see two young men, Lee and Dominic, and they're on the balcony of the Turbine Hall in Tate Modern in London, looking at Tino Segal artwork, which is a performance called These Associations, with about 60 performers milling about on the ground floor of the Turbine Hall, mixing with the mums and dads and punks and drunks and school children that use the space publicly every day. So it's not clear exactly what's going on and there's no signposting. So what we'll hear them doing is trying to figure out, is this something and what is its rationale if it has one?
Are they following somebody? Is that the idea? Or are they following a line?
Yeah, I think just running around eating stuff.
There seems to be like some order though, but we almost got lost.
Follow me.
So whereas Dominic starts quite curiously exploring, is there something going on here? Are they doing something? Is there some intelligible rationale for their movement? Lee more or less is taking the piss and saying, no, they're just running around aimlessly. And so this question of whether this is mysterious and intriguing, which is how Dominic is relating to it, or meaningless and ridiculous, which is how Lee is relating to it, is part of the way that they're dealing with this artwork as they're encountering it. So now I want to show you where they switch this around, and they're going to suggest to one another that they should film themselves commentating on the artwork, and we get to see a sort of backstage moment before they start filming. So the beeping there is their digital camera starting, and of course the sound quality is very bad because it's just recorded by me on the balcony of the Tate Modern with a whole set of static microphones. But what's going on here is that we see Lee saying, oh, let's film it from here, let's make it look like stuck-up art. And Dominic almost suggests a title. He says, this is what London people do on the weekend. So clearly saying, well, we're not London people. And also joining Lee in dealing with this by deciding to create their own cultural product, i.e. a video that I'm presuming they're going to upload to YouTube or distribute via Facebook or something like that. So now we get to see how do they replay their earlier argument about whether it's intelligible and mysterious or meaningless and pointless. We get to see that as they're filming their commentary. So let's have a listen to how they do that. What happens here is that Lee demonstrates he actually has a very clear understanding of how this functions as an artwork, this apparently unintelligible, meaningless and ridiculous project. He knows this is an interactive piece of art. He knows that you're welcome to join in and run around in it. But in fact, he does understand what it's trying to do. And by demonstrating that, he highlights it's trying to say something and presumably failing. But then we also see that Dominic, he says, but we don't know where people are running to and why. He recovers his earlier curiosity about the rationale of the piece and projects the idea that there may be some rationale. So they're differing opinions about this as an artwork and how it functions. Those get staged as part of their media production, refracting the kinds of value that they're experiencing and parameterizing through their interaction and turning them into some other cultural product that they're going to disseminate online. So what I've tried to show with this presentation is how we can observe people's evaluative criteria emerging through their interactions, not directly, but by how they draw them out and expose them to another through interaction. And we can see how they shape the things that they experience in ways that are sensitive to the experiences of others by recipient designing their evaluations for the people who they're with. And finally, we can see how do they use their aesthetic sensibilities to show that they are experiencing and understanding something in a way that creates another kind of cultural product that can be distributed, in this case, as a YouTube video or something of that sort. My proposal for an observatory of cultural value is that it should be integrated into and curious about every conceivable situation where aesthetics and evaluation are used interactionally. So in museums and galleries, cafes and bars, after shows or screenings, but also at home or at work or wherever issues of cultural value become relevant for people in interaction, and where the process of figuring out what the relevant parameters and criteria and methods of evaluation are exposed through the ways that people interact with one another. So this observatory can guide how we select our tools and approaches and measures that can recognise unanticipated and untheorised forms of value as they emerge. So if observation's our starting point, we can see art and aesthetic experiences as occasions where appropriate evaluative methods and measures are embedded in the details of people's practical, mundane interactions. I'm going to put all of the data for this presentation online at this address, all the transcripts and the audio, and I'm inviting you to download them and reanalyze them and then come back to me with questions and criticisms and comments. That's kind of how conversation analysis works. You're not meant to just take the analyst's word for it, you're meant to look at the data and then come up with an argument based on it for yourself. I'm hoping that this is going to be useful for gallerists, for artists, for anyone with an interest in evaluating aesthetic experiences to become curious about this previously unregarded bit of data. What do people talk about? How do artworks become relevant for them in their everyday conversations? What is the social life of these artworks? I think that as the center of aesthetic experience will give us some very good indications as to how we can calibrate our objective measures in ways that are sensitive to the forms of value that emerge through their interactions and that may not have been anticipated by our evaluative frameworks.